It was May 14th, 2008, a quiet Wednesday night in the rural expanse of western Minnesota. The kind of place where roads run straight for miles, and the silence after sunset is so complete, it can feel like a presence itself. Fields stretch into the blackness, and the stars above seem just out of reach. On this night, 19-year-old Brandon Swanson was celebrating. He had just completed a semester at Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby. For most, the end of finals week means freedom, a bit of drinking, laughter, and the kind of careless fun that comes with being young. Brandon, a bright and driven student studying wind turbine engineering, decided to spend the evening with friends in nearby Lind. There was nothing unusual about this, just a young man enjoying life, proud of his accomplishments, and looking forward to a summer of possibilities. Witnesses later confirmed he had a few drinks, but he didn't appear intoxicated, at least not alarmingly so. He was alert, cheerful, even joking around. Later that night, a little before midnight, Brandon decided to drive the 30-mile trip back to his hometown of Marshall, where his parents lived. It was a drive he knew well, a drive he should have completed in under 40 minutes. But something happened. Something that would become one of the most baffling missing person cases in American history. At 1:54 a.m., his parents received a phone call. It was Brandon. His voice was calm, not panicked, not alarmed, just slightly frustrated. He told them he'd accidentally driven his Chevrolet Lumina off the road into a ditch. But he wasn't hurt. He just needed a ride. He told them he was near the town of Lind, just a few miles from home. So his parents got dressed and drove out into the night, expecting to find their son with a stalled car on the roadside. But as the minutes turned to hours, they would never lay eyes on Brandon Swanson again. When Brandon's parents, Brian and Annette Swanson, arrived near the town of Lind, they saw nothing. No car, no ditch, no sign of their son. They called him again, and Brandon picked up immediately. He sounded slightly annoyed, maybe embarrassed. "I can see the lights of Lind," he insisted. "I'm near some gravel roads. There's a field, trees." His voice was steady, not panicked, still calm. He believed his location was obvious, but the truth was far stranger. For over 47 minutes, Brandon stayed on the phone with his father while his parents drove aimlessly, flashing their headlights, hoping he would see them. Brandon told them he'd walk toward town. "Just meet me there," he said. "It's not far." At one point, he said he was walking along a fence line, then past some water, maybe a creek. His voice faded in and out, likely due to poor cell reception in the rural farmland. But the call remained connected. Then came the sound that would haunt his family forever. Brandon suddenly exclaimed, "Oh shit!" And then, silence. The call didn't disconnect. It stayed active for another minute and 20 seconds, but Brandon never spoke again. No rustling, no footsteps, no signal of distress, just dead air. When his parents redialed, there was no answer. They drove up and down gravel roads for hours, searching. The town of Lind was small, no more than a few hundred residents, and the roads surrounding it were eerily empty at that time of night. They found no sign of Brandon's car, no broken fence, no turned-up earth, nothing. By morning, their son was still gone, as if he had vanished mid-step, swallowed by the Minnesota countryside. It wasn't until later that day that authorities finally located his car. But it wasn't anywhere near Lind. It was in a ditch off Taunton Road, a full 25 miles northwest of where Brandon claimed to be, and the terrain around it. Remote farmland, scattered with deep drainage ditches, barbed wire fences, and muddy fields. The phone call made no sense. The location made no sense. And what came next would only deepen the mystery. By morning, the Swansons reported Brandon missing. At first, police weren't concerned. Brandon was 19, legally an adult. He probably just went to a friend's house and fell asleep, they said. It was a story his parents had heard too many times in other missing persons cases. And they didn't buy it. Annette pushed harder. "He wouldn't do this," she said. He called us for help. He was scared. He's gone." Reluctantly, authorities began a search near the spot where Brandon's car was found, off a gravel road outside Taunton, not Lind. The vehicle was undamaged, keys gone, doors closed, no sign of a struggle. Search teams fanned out. Bloodhounds were brought in. The dogs followed Brandon's scent, not toward Lind, but through muddy fields, along a fence line, and near a body of water, the Yellow Medicine River. Here's where things got strange. The dogs abruptly stopped at the river's edge, then picked the trail up again on the other side. That meant Brandon either waded or swam across in pitch black, wearing jeans in the early morning cold, and without any known injuries. There was no sign of him slipping or drowning. Rescue divers searched the river. Nothing. Weeks passed. No footprints, no discarded clothing, no phone, no body. The field where he vanished had no caves, no holes, no places to hide. No one heard anything, no witnesses, and despite being surrounded by farms and open land, no surveillance footage ever surfaced. It was as if Brandon had stepped into a tear in the earth and disappeared between the folds of reality. His parents, desperate, began posting flyers, organizing vigils, and pressuring law enforcement to keep the case active. But still, no trace, no answers, and perhaps worst of all, no closure. The following days blurred into a sleepless haze for Brian and Annette Swanson. Search parties expanded outward from the area where Brandon had likely called from, that silent stretch of country near the Yellow Medicine River. But there were no signs, no torn fabric, no blood, no belongings, no body, only emptiness. Brandon had spoken to his father for 47 minutes, nearly an hour. Not of casual talk, but of desperate, measured steps in the pitch-black night. He'd described fences, gravel, water, buildings faintly visible in the distance, but nothing ever matched the real-world geography. It was as if Brandon were walking through a different version of Minnesota, familiar but wrong, like a mirrored place where roads bent in impossible directions and nothing led home. Then came that last sharp breath, a gasp, a crackle, the words, "Oh shit," and the line went dead. Not a signal loss, not a goodbye, just gone. For weeks, trained teams, local law enforcement, firefighters, volunteers, combed the terrain. Dogs trained to detect the scent of the dead followed a trail toward the river. And then, nothing. The Yellow Medicine River was shallow, calm, easy to cross. Divers scoured it anyway. Still, nothing surfaced. So where did he go? Where do you go when the land itself seems to erase you? Every theory, rational or not, crumbled under scrutiny. There were no signs of struggle, no logical destination. Brandon wasn't distraught. He wasn't suicidal. His mind had been clear, focused, his voice calm, even when surrounded by darkness. At one point, the search dogs picked up a scent leading from the gravel road through the ditch, across a field, and then it stopped, abruptly, as if Brandon had simply lifted from the earth. A phantom step, a tear in the map. Police at first considered the possibility of foul play. Maybe someone had picked him up. Or maybe he'd fallen, but no signs of a vehicle, no cries for help, no discarded items, and no one, not even the most hardened investigators, could explain how a person could vanish like this, in open land, with the moon overhead. As the weeks wore on, hope curdled into obsession. Brandon's parents printed thousands of flyers. They knocked on doors. They re-walked the ditches at night. They stood by the Yellow Medicine River in silence, listening for the voice that had once called out, "I can see lights. I think I'm close." But the lights were a lie, and Brandon was never seen again. At first, everything about Brandon Swanson's disappearance seemed like a tragic miscalculation. A young man disoriented in the dark, a fall into the river, a missed cry for help. But the longer the case dragged on, the stranger it became. People don't just vanish in the middle of a phone call. People don't just walk into open farmland and cease to exist. And the details, those quiet, unsettling details, began to build something deeper than grief. They began to fracture belief. Some said Brandon had wandered into an old abandoned well. Others were certain he'd slipped into the Yellow Medicine River and been carried away, even though his scent trail led away from the water. Others pointed to the end of the call, that final, terrified, "oh shit," and suggested an ambush, an animal attack, or something worse. But there was no blood, no scuff marks, no sign of panic. Only that sentence, and a silence so total, it felt like the land itself had swallowed him whole. Then came the stories. Locals began whispering of strange things that had always haunted those fields. Old stories of disappearances going back decades. Tales of travelers hearing footsteps behind them. Of disoriented hikers walking in circles for hours, despite GPS showing they hadn't moved at all. In online forums and late-night conversations, the theories grew darker. Some called it a time slip, that Brandon had somehow stepped out of our world, into another layer of reality. Others believed he'd been taken by someone or something that couldn't be seen. One psychic claimed she saw him walking, confused, beside a barbed wire fence, until a wall of black rose up and blocked him. Another said the area around the Yellow Medicine River was a thin place, where the veil between worlds wears down. Of course, investigators dismissed these stories, but they couldn't explain why Brandon's footprints stopped without reason. They couldn't explain why the dogs lost his scent in the middle of an open field. And they certainly couldn't explain the sightings. Over the years, scattered reports trickled in. People claiming to have seen someone resembling Brandon on back roads, or in towns miles away, always walking, always silent. But none of them ever checked out. Every lead ended in dust. And through it all, Brian and Annette Swanson kept pressing forward. They weren't interested in ghost stories. They wanted truth. But what do you do when every logical path turns in on itself? When every explanation collapses under its own weight? Theories mounted. Had Brandon been picked up by someone who meant him harm? Had he stumbled across something or someone he wasn't meant to see? Or had he, in some impossible way, stepped beyond the edge of the map? The case was cold, but it wasn't dead. Because the one thing everyone agreed on was that he didn't just disappear. Something happened that night. Something that didn't belong in the rational world. And whatever it was, it has never let go. After the search parties thinned, after the flyers curled and yellowed in the wind, after the public moved on to the next tragedy, Brian and Annette Swanson did not. They kept calling the sheriff. They kept knocking on doors. They kept returning to that lonely stretch of road where their son's voice had gone silent. Hope, at first, is bright, fierce, defiant. But with time, it becomes something colder, sharper, like a splinter under the skin that never stops aching. They marked each birthday, each missed Christmas, each empty chair at the dinner table. They replayed the call over and over, not just in their minds, but on tape, trying to catch some tone in Brandon's voice, some clue in the wind behind his words, some hint of where he went or why. There was nothing, and still they didn't stop. They pushed the state to revisit the case. They called every new detective assigned to the file. They walked fields that had already been combed, and every time they were left with the same gnawing silence. But their persistence birthed something rare in cases like these: change. In 2009, a year after Brandon vanished, the Swansons helped draft and pass a bill in Minnesota known as Brandon's Law, a law that required police to take missing adult reports seriously, without delay. A law that prevented what happened to them, the waiting, the confusion, the jurisdictional shrugging, from happening to another family. It was justice, but not closure, because even as policies changed, the whole remained. The lurid scape around Taunton, Minnesota didn't forget either. Locals grew more wary of that stretch of Highway 68. Some refused to drive it at night. Others claimed that on still evenings, if you turned off your engine and listened, really listened, you could hear faint breathing, a kind of echo not quite human, a memory woven into the wind. Psychics still called the Swansons. Amateur sleuths sent in hand-drawn maps, crop circle theories, and GPS overlays. Search groups still combed fields, even 5, 10, 15 years later, hoping to find bones, a phone, a shoe. But the earth kept its secrets, and the questions deepened. Why didn't the dogs track past a certain point? Why no sign of a struggle? Why no body, ever? And the one question that burned more than all the rest: did Brandon die that night? Or did something else happen? As the years turned to decades, the Swansons grew quieter. They'd said everything there was to say, and yet, Brandon's voice still lingers. That final call, that final moment, not a goodbye, not a farewell, just a startled breath. And then nothing. Brandon became more than a missing person. He became a lingering ache in the heart of a town, a shadow stretched across the prairie. In the years that followed, his name flickered across headlines, forums, podcasts, dissected, debated, mourned. But no answer ever came. Not from the river, not from the fields, not from the cold, unblinking machinery of law enforcement. Just silence. His parents still wait, not in hope, perhaps, but in refusal. Refusal to let go. Refusal to stop speaking his name. Because someone has to remember. And still, every year, when the grass turns green and the ditches fill with meltwater, a part of Marshall, Minnesota holds its breath, listening. Because something happened that night. Something that stole a young man from the edge of a gravel road and left nothing behind. No body, no final message, just a call that ended mid-sentence, and a quiet that has never stopped ringing. And so, Brandon Swanson's disappearance drifts further into the fog of unanswered questions. But here, we do not let the darkness swallow their names. Here, shadows are remembered, and the silence still screams. This is Twilight Vaulted Tales, where the truth hides in plain sight, and every story is a door you may not want to open. Subscribe and step into the space between.